The P-47 originated from the drawing board of Alexander Kartveli of the Seversky Aircraft Corporation, later renamed Republic Aviation. The Thunderbolt is consistently rated as one of the 3 outstanding U.S. Army Air Force fighters of World War II, rated right up there along with the North American P-51 Mustang and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-47, as originally conceived, was quite different from the aircraft which was ultimately to emerge from the Republic factories. On August 1, 1939, Kartveli, in response to an official requirement, proposed a lightweight, high-altitude interceptor to the U.S. Army Air Corps under the company designation of AP-10. It was to be powered by an 1,150 horsepower Allison V liquid-cooled inline engine. This was a radical change in design philosophy for Kartveli, since he had always preferred radial air-cooled engines for fighters because of their greater simplicity and their ability to absorb a greater amount of battle damage. Gross weight would be 4,900 pounds and estimated maximum speed 415 miles per hour. Armament was a pair of .50-inch machine guns mounted in the engine housing. The Air Corps looked over the proposal and was favorably impressed. However, they deemed that additional armament would be required, even if it adversely affected performance. Kartveli increased the size of his AP-10 design somewhat and added 4 wing-mounted .30-inch machine guns. Gross weight rose to 6,570 pounds. In this guise, in November 1939, the Air Corps ordered 1 prototype of the AP-10 design under the designation XP-47. In addition, on January 17, 1940, the Air Corps ordered a stripped, unarmed version under the designation XP-47A. In the meantime, combat reports coming in from Europe were changing everyone's ideas about air combat. More firepower, more armament, more armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks were likely to be required in future air battles. Both the XP-47 and XP-47A had insufficient engine power to accommodate the additional weight required by these features. And the Air Corps came to the conclusion that these designs were likely to fall far short of future air combat requirements. Kartveli went back to the drawing board. In order to accommodate the heavy firepower, armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks, and still provide a performance capable of meeting enemy aircraft on equal terms, a lot of engine horsepower would be needed. Kartveli decided to produce a design based around a turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 twin Wasp 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, one of the most powerful aircraft engines available at the time. Armament was a set of 8 .50-inch machine guns in the wings, following the RAF's trend toward 8-gun fighters and making the Republic proposal among the heaviest armed fighters yet considered by the Air Corps. Total weight was a massive 11,500 pounds, unprecedented for an Air Corps single-seat fighter. On June 12, 1940, Kartveli submitted his ideas to the Air Corps. The Air Corps was sufficiently impressed with the proposal. On September 6, 1940, it ordered a prototype under the designation XP-47B. This designation was sort of unusual at the time, namely using the same P number for what was, in effect, a totally new design. All work on the XP-47 and the XP-47A was canceled, and the serial number of the abortive XP-47 was transferred to the XP-47B. 1 week later, on September 13, 1940, 773 production examples of the Thunderbolt were ordered by the Air Corps, 171 to be delivered as P-47Bs and 602 as P-47Cs. At the same time, the Army contract, placed back in 1939 for 80 P-44 rockets, was canceled. Cart-Valley decided to design the XP-47B fuselage around the large turbo supercharger from the start, rather than to add it onto the aircraft later. In order to preserve a streamlined fuselage with a small cross-section, the large turbo supercharger was placed in the rear fuselage. It was fed by an air duct located beneath the large R2800 engine. Engine exhaust gases were directed back to the rear fuselage in separate pipes to the turbine and were expelled through an exhaust under the rear tail. Ducted air was fed to a centrifugal impeller and was returned to the engine under pressure via an intercooler. Another problem that had to be solved was that the aircraft required a very large 12-foot diameter, 4-bladed propeller in order to fully take advantage of the R2800 engine's high power output. This large propeller, in turn, required a long and stocky undercarriage so that the propeller would have adequate ground clearance during takeoff and landing. If a conventional retractable undercarriage were used for the P-47, its suspension would have to have been placed very far outboard on the wings, leaving insufficient space for the 8 wing guns and their ammunition. In order to solve this problem, the landing gear telescoped and was 9 inches shorter when retracted than when extended. Somewhat surprisingly, this complex telescoping landing gear seems to have caused few problems in the field. Like the earlier P-35 and P-43 fighters, the P-47 was a cantilever low-wing monoplane, the wing being elliptical in shape with the ailerons on the outer trailing edge and flaps on the inner trailing edge. The fuselage was all metal, but initially the control surfaces were fabric covered. The tail wheel was steerable and was fully retractable. All the fuel tanks were inside the fuselage and were self-sealing. The cockpit was protected by armor and was unpressurized. The XP-47B prototype flew for the first time on May 6, 1941, only 8 months after the order was placed. The XP-47B was the largest single-engine fighter built up to that time. On the first flight, the pilot was forced to make an emergency landing because exhaust fumes leaked into the cockpit. At a loaded weight of 12,086 pounds, the XP-47B dwarfed all previous fighters, being almost twice as heavy as most of its contemporaries. Its 18-cylinder radial engine offered 1,960 horsepower at 25,800 feet and gave it a maximum speed of 412 miles per hour, 12 miles per hour faster than Cart-Valley had projected. An altitude of 15,000 feet could be attained in 5 minutes. The prototype was destroyed in an accident on August 8, 1942. At one time, it had been hoped that it would be possible for the RAF to test the Thunderbolt in combat in the Middle East. But production difficulties caused the British Air Ministry to be informed in September 1941 that it was probably not a good idea to do this until all the bugs had been wrung out of the design. The first production P-47B was delivered on December 21, 1941, and 5 more were delivered in March 1942, only 8 months after the XP-47B had first flown. The P-47D was the first version of the Thunderbolt to undergo really large-scale production. The first U.S. Army Air Force order for the P-47D took place on October 14, 1941, when 850 were ordered. However, it was to be followed by many, many more. Toward the end of 1943, 8th Air Force Thunderbolts began returning from escort missions over the continent on the deck, seeking out enemy ground targets of opportunity for their unused ammunition. Somewhat surprisingly, it was found that the Thunderbolt was rather well suited for this new role. This led to perhaps the most successful adaptation of the Thunderbolt as a fighter bomber. The P-47 went to war. Its first operational sorties began on March 10, 1943, and consisted of high-altitude escort duties and fighter sweeps. The first encounter with German fighters came on April 15, when P-47Cs of the 335th Squadron shot down 3 German fighters with a loss of 3 of its own. The high-altitude performance of the P-47C was far superior to anything the Luftwaffe could put up against it, but at low and medium altitudes, the P-47C could not match the maneuverability and climb rates of its opponents. However, the P-47C could outdive just about anything in the sky, and many a Thunderbolt saved itself from a sticky situation by using its superior diving performance to break off combat. The Thunderbolt could outroll any other fighter. The Thunderbolt's 8.50-inch machine guns provided sufficient firepower to destroy any enemy plane which had the misfortune to come within its sights. The robust construction of the Thunderbolt enabled it to absorb a considerable amount of battle damage and still stagger home. The P-47Cs of the 56th, 4th, and 78th Groups of the 8th Air Force were intended as bomber escorts, but were ineffective until July 1943, when they were fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks to lengthen their range. P-47s flew escort missions until the end of 1943. Longer-range P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, which were better suited for a long-range escort role, started to replace them. Once the Mustang began to take over, the Thunderbolt was largely diverted into the ground attack role. After seeing action in North Africa, the 9th Air Force was transferred to England as part of the buildup for D-Day. These units provided much effective ground support for the advancing Allied forces as they penetrated further and further into France. The Thunderbolt, with its heavy machine gun armament and its heavy load of bombs and rockets, was extremely effective in eliminating enemy forces in the face of the Allied advance. The P-47D continued to rack up an impressive number of air-to-air kills against the Luftwaffe, while it beat up the Wehrmacht on the ground during its destructive bombing and strafing career. The Thunderbolt also saw service in Italy. The 325th Group of the 15th Air Force, flying P-47Cs, saw action at Foggia from December 1943 onward. P-47Ds were flown by groups of the 12th Air Force. One of the less well-known operators of the P-47D Thunderbolt was the first group of the Brazilian Air Force. Brazil had declared war on Germany and Italy on August 22, 1942. And this group was attached to the 350th Group of the 12th Air Force. It is not widely known, but the Brazilian Air Force participated in combat on the Allied side of the Italian front in 1944. A squadron of P-47Ds, operated by Brazilian Air Force pilots, was attached to the U.S. 12th Air Force and went into action for the first time on November 11, 1944. Before the end of the war, the Brazilian Air Force had received 88 P-47Ds. Many pilots became aces while flying the Thunderbolt. Outstanding among these was Lieutenant Colonel Francis S. Gabreski, with 31 kills, the highest scoring Thunderbolt pilot. Captain Robert S. Johnson with 28 kills, and Colonel Hubert Zemke with 20 kills. The highest scoring U.S. Army Air Force group in Europe was the 56th Fighter Group, which destroyed 1,006 German aircraft against a loss of 128 Thunderbolts, a ratio of nearly 8-to-1. At one time during the heady days of 1944, there were no less than 31 frontline fighter groups flying Thunderbolts. Thunderbolts fought on all fronts in World War II, including Alaska. Approximately 2/3 of all Thunderbolts built actually reached operational units overseas. In 2.5 years of combat, from March 1943 to August 1945, these Thunderbolts flew over 500,000 combat missions, destroying over 12,000 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. A total of 5,222 Thunderbolts were lost, 824 of them in the heat of combat. This was 54% of the Thunderbolts being lost either to enemy action or to accidents, which was a fairly typical attrition rate for a wartime fighter. Losses of Thunderbolts on operational missions were 0.7% of those dispatched, an exceptionally low figure. By the end of the war, the Thunderbolt had established an overall victory-to-loss ratio of 4.6-to-1. Thunderbolts dropped 132,482 tons of bombs, fired 59,567 rockets, and expended 135 million belts of machine gun ammunition. From D-Day to VE Day in Europe, Thunderbolts destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles and tanks, and 68,000 trucks. By the end of the war, Thunderbolts had destroyed 2,752 enemy aircraft in the air and 3,315 on the ground. The P-47N version of the Thunderbolt was the last version to be manufactured in quantity. It was a specialized long-range version built specifically for service in the Pacific theater. However, the war in the Pacific required fighter ranges even greater than did operations over Germany. In pursuit of better long-range performance, in mid-1944, the third YP-47M prototype was fitted with a new wet wing of slightly larger span and area. The aircraft was redesignated XP-47N. For the first time in the Thunderbolt series, fuel was carried in the wings, a 93 U.S. gallon tank being fitted in each wing. When maximum external tankage was carried, this brought the total fuel load of the XP-47N up to an impressive 1,266 U.S. gallons. This load made possible a range of 2,350 miles. The new wing also incorporated larger ailerons and squared-off wingtips. These innovations enhanced the roll rate of the Thunderbolt and improved the maneuverability. The dorsal fin behind the bubble canopy was somewhat larger than on the P-47D. However, the increased fuel load increased the gross weight of the aircraft. In order to cope with the increased gross weight, the undercarriage of the XP-47N had to be strengthened, which increased the weight still further. The maximum weight rose to over 20,000 pounds. The XP-47N flew for the first time on July 22, 1944. Such was the U.S. Army Air Force confidence in the Thunderbolt design that they went ahead and ordered 1,900 P-47Ns on June 20, 1944, even before the first XP-47N had flown. The P-47N was destined to be the last version of the Thunderbolt to be manufactured. The first P-47N-1RE appeared in September of 1944, and 24 were delivered by year's end. The P-47N-5RE and subsequent batches had zero-length rocket launchers added. The R-2877 engine was installed in late production models, such as the P-47N-25RE. The P-47N gave excellent service in the Pacific in the last year of the war, particularly in escorting B-29 Super Fortress bombers in raids on the Japanese mainland. P-47Ns were able to escort the bombers all the way from Saipan to Japan and on many other long overwater flights. The first P-47Ds to arrive in the Pacific Theater entered service with the 48th Fighter Group of the 5th Air Force in June of 1943. They were initially operated out of Australia and were used on long-range missions to strike at Japanese targets in New Guinea. Soon after Saipan and Guam were taken, the 318th Group and the 508th Group of the 7th Air Force saw action in June 1944, having been the first to take delivery of the P-47N long-range version. They were followed by the 20th Air Force on Okinawa, readying for the final assault on Japan. The war in Europe took precedence over the conflict in the Pacific, and it was not until April of 1944 that the first P-47s reached the China-Burma-India theater. They initially equipped the 33rd, 81st, and 80th Fighter Groups, as well as the 5th and 6th Fighter Command Squadrons of the 10th and 14th Air Forces. They were joined by Thunderbolt I and II aircraft of the RAF. However, many of these late arrivals were not in time to see any action. One of the first RAF squadrons to see action was the 5th Squadron, which was based in Burma and which had previously flown Mohawks and Hurricanes. They flew patrols under the direction of visual ground posts and caused tremendous damage among Japanese troops and supply lines. The Thunderbolt served in the U.S. Air Force until 1955. It would serve in other air forces well into the 1960s, its power slowly overshadowed by the big jets of the era.